Hello and welcome to the SBOM Academy. Today, my partner and co-founder, Anthony Harrison, will introduce the software bill of materials. Thank you for joining, and let's learn about this exciting new data format.
Hello everyone. Today we're going to go and introduce software bill of materials, give you a high-level overview of what a software bill of materials is, contains, and how you can use it. The first thing we really got to look at is software has risks, and if you don't know what's inside your product, you can't assess the risk. So a software bill of materials is all about finding what's inside your software-based product, so you can then understand the risk. And the best way of understanding a software bill of materials is to consider an analogy. So whenever you go to a restaurant, the first thing they often say is, do you have any allergies? And what that is that's part of their risk-based approach to say, well, if you did have allergies, they may have to be more careful in terms of the way they build their burger. So, but for them to understand that, they really have to understand all the ingredients and where those ingredients have come from. And obviously, in some cases, in things like the roll, that's come from multiple suppliers to construct the product. And then as we put the product together, we then get a configuration. So for example, my son doesn't want lettuce, so he'll have a different configuration of his burger compared to me. And what we also want to do is we want to make sure the ingredients are fresh. So we want the beef to be fresh. And maybe we want it to come from a particularly approved supplier. So where's the analogy with software? Well, the fresh ingredients for software are up-to-date and maintained software packages. The software suppliers are your various developers, your integrators, maybe your foundations who have collaborated to create a software product. And the integrator is like the chef. He's putting everything together to deliver the product that you're going to eat. And obviously, the analogy of an allergy having an allergic reaction, well, the equivalent to that for software is we may have a vulnerability in the software component that may lead to a data exploit or something worse. So formally, a software bill of materials is a machine-readable structure which describes your application in a particular format. And they're designed to be shared both within your organization and between organizations. And I think it's clear to understand that software bill of materials are part of your software risk strategy, not just your software development strategy.
But here, there is a lot of focus on the SBOM file as the data holder. Is that really the truth, or is it the data that is the interesting part?
I think it's the content rather than the format. The format's important because that allows you to put it in your tool chain and share the information. But ultimately, it's the content of the SBOM which is key. We'll see that in a minute. But actually, yeah, it's the content rather than the format. But the format is useful to know because that allows you to interpret that data. Really, what we don't want is we don't want to just put it into a spreadsheet because everyone will do a spreadsheet in a different format. This is why we do need some formality. SBOMs have been going on for a while, nearly 15 years. So in early 2010, the Linux Foundation realized that open source licenses need to be a better way of sort of sharing what the licenses were. So this is where one of the standards called SPDX was launched. And that was all about sharing and data exchange of software packages. 2013, a project called the OWASP dependency track in OWASP was addressing a need for managing the risk in how software components, where they were coming from, started to look at the software supply chain. And that ultimately led into 2017 in terms of the launch of the other primary SBOM standard, CycloneDX. And then in 2018, the US government started thinking more about the need to have greater transparency in terms of the way software is constructed. And that started a number of discussions that are continuing on to today in terms of how to make software more transparent so that we can understand the risk that may lie there. And I think we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a growing interest in SBOMs. Sometimes it's due to an incident like SolarWinds or Log4j. In other cases, it's because there's been regulation. So the major regulation was in 2021 in the US in May when the US had their exec order. 9 months later, there was an assessment to say, well, how ready are organizations to comply? The Linux Foundation did a report, and I think they came out with saying we need to do quite a little bit more, particularly in education, in tooling. And that's where OpenSSF started a number of work groups, of which one is called SBOM Everywhere, which is looking to share SBOM best practices to help the adoption. And then there's been various regulations and consultations. So the Cyber Resilience Act started in 2022. That is now in law as at the end of 2024. The UK did some consultation, and at the October 2023, all medical devices sold in the US had to have software bill of materials available as part of their submission to the FDA. So there's been quite a lot of development. Yes, go on.
Yeah, I see that there are a lot of regulators being interested in this, but what about the customers? I mean, if there's another Log4j coming, as you ask here on the slide, are they requiring SBOMs? Are they ready to actually find out what components they have within their infrastructure?
I think there's not enough take up at the moment. At the moment, there's very much on the producers of software or software products, digital products, which I think there has been a steady progress. What is needed now is to sort of shift that emphasis into the consumers so they can start making informed decisions about the risk of their digital products and how they can better protect their organization and their customers. I think we've now got enough traction in terms of understanding why an SBOM is required now and what an SBOM is. Now we're going to use it. How can we maximize the benefit that an SBOM will bring that organization? And as we like to say on the slide, are you ready for the next, what we might call a celebrity vulnerability like Log4j? Log4j cost businesses an awful lot of effort and time and money because they didn't have the information. If they have an SBOM, they should be able to assess the impact far more efficiently.
The real scary part is that there are still vulnerable systems out there. And the version of Log4j that contain this issue is still being downloaded 1,000 times every week. So we really need to stress this fact that we need this for risk management.
And this is part of the risk strategy. We'll see this in the next slide about where the SBOM should be as part of your life cycle. So yes, if you've got a vulnerable version of a component, you need to be aware of it and making a conscious business decision to say whether you need to upgrade it or whether you have enough mitigations to protect that potential vulnerability from occurring in your product. There are two standards, SPDX and CycloneDX. The latest versions are 3.0 and 1.6. They're under continual evolution, and as the industry works with them, the SPDX is an ISO standard. CycloneDX is an ECMA standard. So if your organisations do say we only want to use standardised formats, then you've got both potential options. Transforming between the two standards is possible. It's not completely one for one because each standard will have some strengths and some weaknesses. But ultimately for the software bill of materials, the core components are generally the same. Which comes on to the next slide. So basically, the core content is really in 3 parts. The metadata, which is really just saying when was the SBOM created and who created it and how was it created. So it's going to be machine generated. So which tool did you use? Which version of that tool? Maybe where was it generated? But most important, when was it generated? Because that's, it's a moment in time. Then we have all the actual core content, which is the components, the software components. They may be files, they may be packages, they may be containers, and then associated metadata with them, maybe licenses, what version it is, where you can download it from. And then the third part is the relationships between those components, which component depends on which other component. So that really helps you understand, if there is a change required to a component, you can then start assessing the impact that you may have. That hierarchy is really important. You want to see the relationships, particularly those relationships where are often hidden. So although your core product may not be directly using a component, indirectly it may be using a component. It's important to see that, and that's where we saw a lot of that from the Log4j, where people were not aware they were using Log4j directly. And this is really, an SBOM really is helping you the SDLC, the secure the lifecycle. And it should be helping you to answer the questions that you should all really be asking yourselves. Where are the third-party components? What are they up to date? How are you monitoring vulnerabilities that are occurring on the supply chain? How is the applications built? Has there been any changes are you checking the integrity of the applications from source file to binary to deployment? So really all this is all part of an SBOM is really supporting the SDLC. It's not, so all the information should be readily available in an organization if they're following a secure lifecycle. License compliance is key. If you are abusing the licenses, then you should probably be aware of that and make necessary corrections.
Yeah, the interesting part here is that this fits very nicely with the Cyber Resilience Act, which emphasizes maintenance of a product during the product's whole life cycle. And SBOM, as we see in this picture, is at the core of that process. So yeah. with the CRA, SBOMs will be necessary, and the CRA actually mandates for this reason vendors and manufacturers to have an SBOM for their product.
Yeah, and it's a bit, the life cycle is from design to the end of product support, not just end of life, because products live beyond their end of life into support. So yes. Yeah. And it's very much important that you do keep that, and you manage obsolete software detection. That means that is is your software going to still be maintained? These are the questions you should already be asking anyway. It just brings it into focus.
Yeah.
So and then there's various people who could be interested in the SBOMs. It's not just the engineering teams in the development and operations team. The compliance teams, the GRC teams should be asking questions because they should be they have different interests, but the data is a common set of data. And as we see components going into big products and then into a solution, we can see that through a life cycle of the supply chain. And then we see the software supply chain at the bottom, where we're seeing developers becoming a supplier, becoming an integrator. And really the message here is if you are producing an SBOM, you should also be consuming an SBOM, because generating an SBOM has interesting information. You should be actually looking at that information that's been found and assessing whether that information is suitable for your end users or your use cases. You may have a different use case if you're doing an internal development from one you're actually selling to a product as to a third party.
But we have to stress the fact that there are very few pieces of software that is written from scratch today. You build software based on components, and those you need SBOMs from those upstream vendors, whether it's an embedded system with a Linux operating system, or you just use libraries and components from third parties.
Yes,
so
exactly.
you even if you're a producer towards your end users, you're a consumer in regards to your upstream vendors.
Yes, very, very, very true. And yeah, and you're going to have multiple SBOMs. Don't think you're going to have one super SBOM for your whole product. I think you're going to have a group of SBOMs and a hierarchy of them. Link them with other things like hardware bill of materials as well. So it's a growing need of this transparency that we really want. And then there's a life cycle, and SBOM really has a life cycle. So ultimately, your CISO or someone in leadership has some oversight. There's a process being followed, but generally, you're going to, the development team are going to be generating SBOMs, maybe out of their development pipeline, but that needs to be analysed. The result of the generation needs to be analysed. Are you following the development policy, maybe for use of licenses, particular type of licenses? Are you using components from that you accept as being previously approved? Various different use cases depending on your organisation. That forms part of the governance. And I think a lot of people think an SBOM is just all about the generation. No, the insights you gain from the analysis is really, really crucial. And you'll always get something you didn't expect. And then you're going to come up with a number of issues which you then have to prioritize. Those issues could be, there's a vulnerability. How do we prioritize the fix of that vulnerability? But that becomes part of your product evolution, your product management team. And then you're then going to go back into development where you remediate the issue. And then you start again and you regenerate because you get a new baseline and you start again. So SBOMs are a continuous process. It's important to keep your SBOMs up to date. But if you have different versions of a product out in, with your customers, it's important to keep multiple versions of an SBOM so you've got an indication of what's out in the field and, when you're supporting multiple versions, in parallel. And the insights you can typically get, particularly in analysis, is, well, when you're looking across maybe multiple SBOMs in your organization, have you got multiple versions of the same component across applications? Maybe that's a paid product. So you paid licenses for 3 or 4 different versions. Maybe you can optimize that and say, just have everyone on one version. You should be looking at, have you got any obsolete or unmaintained components? You've got to think about, well, if there was an issue in that component downstream, how would you cope if there was an issue, if it wasn't being maintained? Should you be actually maybe insourcing that component yourself? It's, so that you can then be responsive to an issue. How quickly is the component being updated? A lot of components get updated with new features, but really, do you need to use all those features? Can you stay with a baseline? But as long as it's free, the vulnerabilities aren't affecting your product, then maybe that's sufficient for you to keep on that particular version. But you probably have to document that vulnerability doesn't have an impact on your product. And I think one of the other important things is actually looking at the supply chain. You are dependent on a growing number of software suppliers and communities. really you've got to think about, are you supporting them? Because a lot of these are just volunteers. You're probably gaining a lot of benefits from the work, the hard work that they are doing. Maybe you need to be supporting them in some way. Maybe helping them with patches, maybe helping them with fixing vulnerabilities, maybe just supporting them by sponsorship. By looking across all your SBOMs, you're going to get a list of the suppliers. And you're probably going to find you didn't realize you haven't just got 10 suppliers, you've probably got many thousands of suppliers. And some of those suppliers are just individuals. Any one of those could be a weak link in your supply chain. You should always have some license compliance policies, you know, and ensure that your components are matching that development policy. You know, there's some organisations who are rightly worried about copyleft licenses. You know, how are those? Do you have copyleft licenses in your supply chain? How are you managing that risk? Ultimately, this is all about improving the security and resilience of your product for you and your customers. Excuse me. And this is the classic thing. You know, there's a project that your infrastructure may be heavily dependent on. You've never met the developer, but actually, if he stopped maintaining his product, then your components that are based on it wouldn't be able to survive. So therefore, can you identify these products that may need a little bit of help to support your product resilience and security posture. One of the challenges that we often see is the quality of SBOMs. There are many tools out there that will generate SBOMs. There is a minimum standard that has been identified in terms of what the core content should be. This is often quite difficult to achieve, particularly to getting what we call the metadata from the packages. Do we get reliable naming of the packages? Do we get particular reliable ways of where the supplier is, how to contact the supplier? Do we have the relationships clearly defined? You know, what's the relationship between two components? And so this is one of the things we have to be aware of. And often we need to what we call data enrichment, which is to enhance the quality of the SBOMs. So while it'd be nice for everything to be automated, there may be some necessary to validate the data and then maybe enhance the data in a particular way to correct some discrepancies. Because ultimately, if you're going to share this SBOM, because as we say, we want SBOMs to be shared widely with you and your customers, then you want to make sure you're sharing accurate content. And just an example, one of the things I often see is looking at the licensing information. There is a standard license identifier that SPDX defined many years ago, and often you'll see components reported against different ways of defining the license. So validating the license identifier is probably a key component. So there's maybe rationalizing the license identifier is a key part of your validation. And one of the other things to look at is component names. There are two primary ways of identifying a component. One is called CPE and one is called package URL. There are different ways of capturing the same information. Package URL is primarily aimed at open source components at the moment. It's about to become a standard. CPE is very much just a free format text and tries to identify the supplier and as well as the package name and version. The level of problem with CPE is often it's quite variable. Different ways of specifying the same product. There's no consistency. Package URL tries to address that by having a far more consistent way of defining the components. So if you often you will see a component identified with both, which is really good. Increasingly, people are probably starting to use Perl as the way to reference a component, particularly when you're using vulnerability management and looking at vulnerability data.
And we're going to go through that more deeply in another SBOM Academy seminar.
Yes.
Focused on SBOM and vulnerability handling.
Yeah. There's lots of guides out there. This is one particular one, CycloneDX published, which is about a guide to SBOMs. There are other various documents, books, webinars, etc. about SBOMs. All very useful, but I think software bill of materials don't live in isolation. They're part of a far bigger ecosystem about supply chain. So, software now exists in many different formats, like services, like containers. So you've got to think about where your software is deployed and how it's deployed. So to summarize, really, SBOMs are a valuable artifact to help you manage your risk. They're part of supporting you the software lifecycle, and by giving you more transparency, they're helping you make your software more secure. By being more open, you actually are being more secure. But SBOMs require a partnership with the whole of the supply chain, so both upstream and downstream. So that's why it's important you share SBOMs and make SBOMs available. You don't have to make them publicly available, but be available to share them on demand. And that really means that SBOMs need to be considered as part of your procurement governance process. So increasingly, we're seeing regulations requiring that mandating an SBOM is made available. Or maybe you should be actually doing that with any of your suppliers as well, making sure they can make SBOMs available to you, such that you can understand the risk that they may be posing to you as you integrate their components with you into your ultimate product. Yeah, share, but carefully. There's obviously some quite valuable information, but this is no different to it's like a contractual obligation that you may have existing engineering information that you want to share. So share it carefully. I would consider thinking about looking at the open source supply chain and working out where they may need support. Particularly for the larger organizations, they can help the small organizations to be more secure, help them in terms of maybe with good best practices. And I'm always very careful about vulnerability management. Things like the COA want software to be as free of vulnerabilities as possible. It's really hard to write software without vulnerabilities or defects. But what we need to do is to understand where you are at any moment in time. Are you exposed to the vulnerability? Is the vulnerability exploitable in your context? Maybe you've got countermeasures that protect you. Well, understanding that and sharing that assessment is going to be key. And the regulations is increasingly demanding this level of transparency, so be prepared. I write lots of open source tools to try and help your journey. So that's one of you can find me on GitHub. I also write various articles on LinkedIn to share various insights into SBOMs. So please feel free to follow me on LinkedIn or contact me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you for listening to this webinar around software bill of materials. To learn more, please visit our website, sbomeurope.eu, follow us on LinkedIn or on our YouTube channel. I hope to see you again soon, and please subscribe to our channels.